All right, welcome to our very first session for our Intro to Biblical Hebrew course. We're going to start at the very beginning today. We're going to be starting with the alphabet. Maybe you've learned other languages before, or maybe you remember this as a little kid learning English, but this is the building blocks for everything. So we're going to park on this for a few minutes today, and it's going to help us do a number of things. Obviously, knowing the alphabet is going to help us as we read text, as we copy texts, as you work on things in your own notes or in class. We're going to see in the next couple of sessions, once we know this alphabet and then the vowels as well, we'll be able to pronounce words and read text out loud, which is kind of part of what we should be doing in a class like this, and a skill that we're going to be working towards throughout the entire year. But we'll also see that using the alphabet is going to be very important for how we access resources, like dictionaries and lexicons. Without an understanding of the alphabet, specifically the order of the alphabet, that would be a nearly impossible task. So we're going to be working on this for all of those reasons and more. But our focus today is not going to be as much on the kind of background of the alphabet. There was some of that in our textbook by Ross, though we'll look at a few examples of images from artifacts or manuscripts that illustrate some of those things. Our focus is really going to be on just how do we draw each character, how do we form each character. I know there's a few helpful charts for us in that section in our first chapter, but I think it would be helpful as a group to kind of look at that case by case. Every letter, how do we write it, and how do we form each character. So that's going to be the real focus for today. The kind of sights and sounds of the Hebrew alphabet is where we're going to be for the next little while. Before we get at formation, though, why don't we look at the short story of some of the major moments in the development of what we kind of eventually call a square Hebrew script, which is a script that we will use, which is a script that you'll find in printed versions of the Hebrew Bible and even the medieval manuscripts and codices that they're based on. In the grand scheme of things, that's a fairly late development. If we wanted to wind the clock back, we'd be talking about Paleo-Hebrew, and that is a script that we're seeing here in a very famous inscription, and you find this in inscriptions throughout museums. If you're ever in Jerusalem specifically, you'll see a number of inscriptions like this. We see this on coins. We see this even on inscriptions that are beyond what we would associate perhaps with the Israelites, even in some ancient Near Eastern texts. Now, the Paleo-Hebrew script that we see here is the Siloam inscription. You may know this from the story of Hezekiah's tunnel. You hear about the story in 2 Kings 20, 2 Chronicles 32, as well as the story of the siege of Jerusalem in the Sennacherib Prism and Herodotus and other sources outside the Bible. For us, what we want to know is this inscription here that we're seeing. We can zoom in a little bit on it. Is not written in a script that we're going to be able to identify in a moment as a square Hebrew script. That's Paleo-Hebrew. This is an inscription that's commemorating these two kind of engineering crews digging this tunnel down to the Siloam pool outside of the walls of Jerusalem. It's found in this tunnel. But that script, for our purposes, we'll just kind of lock that in our mind, see how it looks, and we'll compare that to a few things that follows. This is called Paleo-Hebrew. We're not going to be learning that alphabet, but that's just a little bit of background for what we're talking about when we use that term, Paleo-Hebrew script. Now what we're looking at here is something that will look a little more familiar. We're still kind of in that evolutionary process of the Hebrew script that we'll eventually get to, but now we're talking about a square script. And the square script that we're talking about is in fact a square Aramaic script. Aramaic is another language, more or less the common language of the ancient Near East from the 8th century on. And from that time on, or at least as far as we can tell, certainly by the 2nd, 1st century or so, Jewish scribes were also using that square script. What we're looking at here is a few examples of that. The image up top is a Cave 4 copy of Deuteronomy from Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is actually one of the oldest copy of parts of Deuteronomy 5 specifically containing the Ten Commandments. And if we zoom in on this manuscript just a little bit, what we'll start to see, even before we've learned anything to do with the Hebrew alphabet, is that this looks very different from what we saw on the previous screen. Here we can see Their letters are, to the naked eye, we could say, a little more uniform. They're hanging from a line. There's only one character that goes above the line. That's this one here, these lamids, as you can see. Other than that, we're seeing that we almost hang all these characters from a clothesline. And all of the characters are more or less written in a box, a square box. This is starting to look what we might recognize today, more like a font than perhaps anything else. If we zoom out again from here, what I have on the bottom of our screen is an example of a scribal hand from a manuscript like that Deuteronomy manuscript from about that era. And here what we're seeing again, we haven't learned any of the names or letters of the alphabet, but again, it looks very different, and we're starting to see a bit more uniformity in how these letters are actually written. So that's where we're starting to see our square script. One of the first places we start to see that is in these Dead Sea Scrolls. Here we're starting to get something that is a little more familiar to us from what we saw in our textbook reading for this week. The image up top is where we're going to spend the most time, but just before we get there, what we're seeing down on the bottom is a leaf folio from the Aleppo Codex. Now, the Aleppo Codex is a very important codex for biblical studies broadly, for Judaism, Christianity. The Aleppo Codex and the Leningrad Codex, which we'll be looking at in class in our Hebrew Bibles from time to time, those come in a tradition of text called the Masoretic tradition. And these texts come from the 10th and 11th centuries. These are manuscripts associated with the scribal school operating in Tiberias from starting in about the 7th century of the Common Era. And this scribal school took it upon themselves to transmit the Hebrew Bible, to copy it in the manuscripts that they had available to them, as well as develop vowels, a system of vowels to capture the sound of how it should be read. One of the challenges that we have as English speakers, perhaps, is approaching Hebrew is that there are no vowels, at least not native to the language. Even in modern Hebrew, the only place you'll find vowels in modern Hebrew is for children's books or books meant to kind of bridge into that language. Other than that, the language is more or less has a consonantal framework. Now, at first glance, that might sound odd to us, but the reality is, as in English, we really only pay attention to consonants. You can read an entire page of text without the vowels and more or less make sense of it quite often. But what the Masoretes did was recognize that still there were times where a word could be pronounced in more than one way, perhaps. And what they did was something quite innovative. Rather than include things within the text, because the text was sacred, they developed a way of including vowels in and around the text. So what you're seeing here, again, we're not going to deal with vowels this lesson, that will be in a session or two, but what you're seeing here are a number of dots and dashes, more or less, that are all, almost all of them, around that consonantal framework of the Hebrew characters that we see here in our alphabet. Now, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, that's where we'll be spending our time next session, but in a few slides, I hope that gives us a sense of where the Hebrew alphabet had been, where it went, and how we received the text, or at least the form of the script that we're dealing with and learning in this lesson. So that's kind of the backstory. Now let's get down to how to draw these things and what are the names of these characters. I want to go through the entire Hebrew alphabet here, and then we'll go back to the beginning and think about how to form each of these characters. So we have 22 characters in the Hebrew alphabet. Now, if you count these, you'll see that there are more than 22, because some of those characters will look differently if they're placed at the end of the word. So we'll talk about final characters as well. We'll also highlight a few characters that look very similar, ones that you want to be careful to differentiate between in your writing of them as well as in your reading of them. But before we do any of that, let's just look at some of these and read through the alphabet. Now, Hebrew reads from right to left, so we're going to start in the top right corner here. Up top we have Aleph, then Beit, then Gimel, then Dalet, then Hey, Vav, Zayin, We can already see those two look similar, so we're going to want to make sure we pay attention to that. Then we have chet, tet, yod, kaf. Now here's our first example of a character that is written in more than one way, depending on where it's written. These two we're going to want to put together in our minds. The first character here is a kaf. If you have a kaf at the beginning or at the middle of a word, it will look like that. If you have a kaf at the end of the word, it will look like this. So those two are the same character. They're just written differently depending on their position. The next two, or the next character rather, is a lamed. What you notice about the lamed is that this character is the only one that has a section that extends above the line. In English, we write on a baseline. In Hebrew, as we saw in some of those earlier manuscript images, the characters hang from a line, as if you're kind of hanging clothes on a laundry line. The lamed is the only character that will have something that extends above that line, so it really sticks out when you're reading a text. Now, the next pair of characters here are our mems. Now, at this point, you can probably guess why we have two of them. This here is our mem in a medial position. So if it's the beginning or in the middle of a word, it will look like that. Here's our mem in a final position. It looks slightly differently. If it's the end of the word, you'll write it that way. So we're going to skip down to the next line, again, reading from right to left. And right away, we have another medial and final character group. These two are our nuns, our N sound. So again, here's our medial position, or at the beginning or in the middle of a word, a nun. A final position nun will look like this. After that, we have samik, we have ayin, and then we have our pair of characters for the letter P, which is our P sound or our PH sound. Here's another one of those characters where we have a medial character formation and a final character formation. The next set of characters does the same thing. We have what is known as a tsade. And tsade has, again, a medial character and a final character. They look similar, but they have some different characteristics. So those are our characters you want to be aware of for medial and final positions. From there on out, we have kof, we have resh, and we have two characters that are quite similar, but they sound differently. We have a shin, sin, and tav. Now we'll go over this again in class together, but those are the names of the characters. In our textbook, they give us a really nice kind of overview of the sounds of the characters, or the sounds that they create. Most of them create a sound that is quite similar to their name, but we'll go over that together as a group in class. Now, we're going to look at character formations in a moment, but before we do that, I thought it might be useful just to flag some of the characters that we want to be aware of that look similar or could be confused for a character nearby. As we go through the Hebrew alphabet, there's a few of these that we want to at least highlight. In my mind, the ones that we kind of want to become aware of are these two here, which we flagged earlier. That'd be these two here, the Vav and the Zayin. As you can see, the head stroke is not as prominent on one. It can be easily confused, so we're going to want to pay attention to form those characters properly when we get to that in a moment. We also have these two. The He on the right, and on the left, the Chet. Those are quite similar to one another. And if we wanted just to add in one more character, the Tav could at times be confused for one of those. So we want to make sure we distinguish between these characters when we're writing them. All right, what else could we talk about for similar characters? We start the alphabet with Aleph and then Bet, but our Bet, if we're not careful, can look very close to our medial Kaf. As you can see on the Bet, we have just this kind of foot there that extends past the downstroke. That's going to be really important for differentiating between those two characters. Now a few more, without getting too many lines and getting confusing on this page here. Our dalet, that D sound over here, our dalet, we're going to want to make sure we draw that in a way that is different from our resh, our R sound. Something like we saw with our bit, only here the head stroke, it's that upper line that extends over the downstroke that's going to be really important for us. That one's going to matter for differentiating between those two. And if we can just add one more here with hopefully without drawing too many lines all over the place, our final mem, and perhaps even our medial mem, depending how you want to write these, they can look something like a somic. As you can see, probably mostly with that final character here and the somic here, there's some similarities there. The somic is a more circular closed circle, whereas the final mem is almost like a closed square with that overhanging edge right there. So those are some things to be aware of in terms of the names of these letters, as well as letters to watch out for. We flagged those medial and final characters. That might take some time to get used to, but at least we know what they are for now. But for the kind of rest of our session here, or for most of the rest of the session, I want to focus on forming these characters. So why don't we just start right at the beginning again. We'll go through each of these, including the final characters. So we'll go back to Aleph here, and we'll form it. The easiest way to form this Aleph is to do a downstroke, an angular stroke like that, from top left to bottom right, and a stroke like that. Obviously the font that we're looking at up top is really crisp and clear for a number of other reasons, but for our purposes, that's more or less we want to be doing two strokes for the Aleph. We have one going down like this, and then another that comes in alongside like this. So we'll call that our Aleph. We are now officially 1/22nd of the way through the Hebrew alphabet. All right, well, let's move on, and we will see if we can't add some characters to our repertoire. So why don't we try out the next one? We're going to be looking at the bet, which was right here, and to form this one, we're going to do this in two strokes. 1, 2. And here what we saw earlier was to differentiate this from our kaf later on. We're going to want to make sure that we have that foot that extends across the page, or across the downstroke, just like that, and that will be our bet. All right, well, let's move right along. Our gimel, the gimel. We'll do this again in two strokes. That's our first stroke. There's our second stroke. Our gimel will look like something like that. And that gives us our G sound in the Hebrew alphabet, and that is more or less what we're looking at for our Hebrew gimel. So we'll do that in two strokes, just as we did there. All right, moving right along. Let's have a look at our dalet. The dalet will be an easy one. One straight across the top, and then one straight down like this. Here again, as we said earlier, this little section here is going to be very important for seeing this as a different character from our resh, which we know has some similar characteristics, but again is a different animal. So there's our dalet, two strokes, one across the top and one down. Hey, let's move on to our hey. That's this one here. We're going to do a stroke that looks something like the dalet, but now we're going to add a stroke over here. There's our hey. A pretty easy one, but again, what's important is leaving this open, because that will differentiate it from our chet, which does not leave it open. So that will be an important thing to keep in mind when drawing your hey. Okay, Vav and Zayin. We'll do these two together just for the sake of showing the comparison. Our Vav will look something like that. You want to do one stroke, and I would kind of recommend keeping that stroke like that with some sort of an angular stroke downward like that, because in a moment we'll see that our Zion looks something similar, but it's easiest to differentiate between the two by doing this in two strokes. And here we'll see that the difference then is quite evident in our writing of this character. Whereas that is an angular head going down with a second stroke, here we have more of an arc on a single stroke. So that's our Vav, that's our Zion put together. But again, they're doing something different, or something quite different for us in the Hebrew alphabet. So make sure those two are separate in our minds and in our kind of developing alphabet. Now, what we're going to get to here is a character we've talked about, but we haven't quite written, our Chet. Now, our Chet is another one of those characters, as we said now, looks similar to our Hey. So when we write this, we're going to write it in one motion, but it's 3 strokes. And here, as you can see, when we do that, we have no other option but to leave that closed to make it very clear that this is a Chet and not a Hey. Now our next character that we're dealing with is one of our T sounds. We go Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet. So we hear that T sound. Now this one, in terms of how to write it in handwriting, you might see a few different descriptions of this or ways of doing this in grammars. The way I'm going to show you is one that I think is quite basic, but also is easily distinguishable from other characters. Something like the head stroke of a Zion, and then an arc around. That would be something like a cursive tet. And there you can see there's not much else to confuse that with. So that would be one way that you could do that. I think our textbook has a slightly different formation, giving you an angle on the other side. Either way, make sure that you have it clear in your mind what character that is and how it's different from the others around it. But that would be how we write the Hebrew character tet. All right, the Yod. This is another one that we want to pay attention to, because at least in earlier traditions, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this can look very close to a Vav or at times even a Zion. But for us, I think the easiest way to differentiate between the Vav and the Zion and the Yod is the Yod is a character that doesn't extend down the entire line. So if our Yod looks like that, our Vav looks like that. So the Yod is one that we can see is the only character, in fact, that doesn't take the entire box that it's given. Rather, as you can see here in this comparison, it only takes the upper part of that line. And our Yod, we'll see, is a very important character, helping form a number of other sounds, but it gives us that y sound, or even an e sound, as we'll get into later on with vowels. But for us, for now, that's how we write it. All right, well, let's move on to our Kaf. We have 2 of these characters. These are our characters that we have some options with depending on where it's positioned in a word. In a medial position, so that means if it's at the beginning or in the middle of a word, we're going to write it like this, like a backwards C. And that way it'll become very clear to us that this is not a beit. It doesn't have that foot extending across the line. We'll just draw it like that, and it will be very clear to us what we're dealing with. Now, if we have a kaf in a final position, then we're going to write this very similar to what we do with a dalet, only we're going to extend it down below the line. Now, a minute ago we said the lamed was the only character that extends above the line. We're going to have a few characters, namely some of these final characters, that extend below the line, like this. And the final kaf is one of our first, or is our first character to do that here. So the way that we'll be able to tell that is different from a dalet is that it just hangs down below the line in a way that's not true of the dalet, as you know from earlier on in our alphabet. So we're almost halfway there. Now our lamed, as we said, is one of these characters that extends above the line. So when we write that, we are going to want to make sure that that character extends above the line. So if we imagine this as being our kind of clothesline here, then this section will extend above it, and the lamed kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. When you see it in a text, whether it's a manuscript or a printed edition, that is the only letter that will point upwards beyond the line. Okay, let's get to our next pair of our characters, this medial and final characters, the mem, and this is our M sound, that mem. So let's start off with our first character. In a medial position, we're going to write it like this. So we had this kind of upper arm like this, and then a kind of an open circle around. That's how we're forming our medial mem. Our final position mem, we can just kind of write a box like this, and then what's very important for us is that we have this extend over the top, and that this is more or less a square shape, because as we'll see in a minute, this samic can look similar, except for it has more of an arc to it, almost a circular shape. So for us, here's our medial mem and our final position mem. All right, well, let's move right along into this next line. And this next line we're going to be looking at is our next kind of set of medial and final characters. Here's our nun, and that's going to give us our N sound, nun. To write these, we'll do them again as a pair. First, the medial character, so again, beginning or middle of a word. Let's just do one stroke like this. One stroke like that. It's a narrow character, our nun. As we said with our final kaf a minute ago, our final nun will look a little bit differently. So we'll start the same, but like that kaf, it's going to extend down below the line. So same formation, but instead of terminating the character here with that left stroke, we're just going to bend that down, if you will, and we're going to have it extend down below the line. So medial nun and final nun, that's our N sound, and that's our two characters that achieve that for us in Hebrew. All right, let's get to samic. We've talked about it a little bit. We're going to write this in a way that starts something like our final mem. This is one of our S sounds, but we are going to, rather than make a square, give it something more of a circle. And you can have that arc as defined, perhaps a little bit less than it is there, or as much. But the main thing for us is this has to hang over the top, and this can't be a square, otherwise we have a final mem. So we'll call that our samic. Make sure in our minds we keep that different and distinct in the way we write it from that final mem, and we should be just fine. All right, let's get to what's next. Next up, we're dealing with ayin. Our ayin is this character that we see here in between all of that cluster of scribbles. This is our character here, ayin. How do we draw this? Well, we will do it something like this. One stroke down like this, kind of on a leftward slope and an angle, something like a quarter pipe or something like this, and then we have another character, or another line, a stroke rather, that comes together with it like that. And there's our ayin. Now we've seen a few characters like this yet, we haven't named them as this yet, but we're going to talk about gutturals in a minute. The ayin doesn't really have much of a sound on its own, but that's how we write it. And we'll come back to flag these guttural characters for us in a moment. So we're thinking of how to write an ayin. That's what we'll be dealing with right there. So there we have our first few characters of this second last line. Now we've got the next cluster of characters we're dealing with here are medial and finals. Pe, medial and final pe, and medial and final tzade. So let's take these in turn. Our pe is going to give us that that P sound or that PH sound as well. Now, in terms of how to write these, we'll do them together just to show the comparison. The way I write these is take one line over the top. There's our medial pe. So if we saw how that went, it was one line over and then looped around like this. For our final pe, then, something like our final nun, we're going to do the beginning of the character in the same way, but then we'll have it extend down below that line, because remember, Hebrew hangs from the lines. It's not written on a baseline like we would have in ruled paper in English. So we'll start this way again. We'll have one over, up, and down. So the important thing for us here is these sections are essentially the same, but again, instead of curving up for the final character, we're going to bring that down below the line. So there's our medial and our final pe. So what do we have next? We have our Artsade. Now Artsade, again, if we've learned anything from these medial and final characters, it's that they start very similarly, but they end off and they terminate down below the line. So that should come to no surprise here. Now this might be a little more complicated for how to draw this, but we're going to do this in 2 strokes. So our medial tsade will start off like this. We'll come down and then we'll hook back, and then we'll give us one more stroke like this. So we had 2 strokes. The first comes across the top, extends downward to the right with an elbow, and comes back here. And then sort of a short angular elbow stroke here, not unlike what we saw on the top of our olive here at the very beginning of the alphabet. Now our tsade, final tsade, looks slightly differently. So we're going to do this. We're going to start with a hook, and then another hook that joins it halfway down. So something similar to what we saw with the others. These two have a little bit of a different character formation in the top half, but we're dealing with this section here as a kind of a cane coming down, and then these figures are more or less the same, where we have kind of an angular stroke that intersects with the first midway down. But as always, we see that extends down below the line, and that's the telltale sign of our final characters. So that's what we have there for our final set of medial and final characters. Now we're dealing with kof. Now kof sounds produces a similar sound to our kaf. Kof is what we're dealing with down here. And this is a character that has 2 strokes to it, and they intentionally don't intersect. And this is our only character that's a non-final character that extends below the line. So let's have a look at this quite closely. For our kof, we'll have one straight down line. Easy, simple. And then we'll have another that does that. Now we can have it connect to the top here or not if you like, but the most important thing here is they don't connect down at the bottom. So we have one line down, first stroke, second stroke over, and then leave this open, and that's how we get our kof. Again, we'll see that the sounds between these two are similar, so we'll try to keep that different in our heads, but once we get to some words and some context, that might make a little more sense. For now, that's how we read our kof. All right, let's look at our resh. We talked about our resh when we were looking at our dalet way up here. Our dalet had that one line across the top and one line down, so that was 2 strokes. But our resh, the easiest way to keep these things separate in our minds and in the way we write them, is to include only 1 stroke across the top and then down. If you keep it a fluid stroke, then you don't risk the possibility of confusing it with the dalet, which otherwise would simply look like this, perhaps. So when we are writing our dalet, if we can do it with 1 stroke across and then an elbow and then down, or our resh rather, then we shouldn't have any problem confusing the two when we are writing or when we're reading. Now these next 2, we have sin and shin, or shin and sin. The first character we're dealing with here is shin. The second is sin. So one gives us that sh, shin. The next gives us an S sound, sin, similarly to our samic. In fact, some words in earlier texts, depending on a scribe, those 2 sounds and symbols could be interchangeable. So here's our sh, and here's our s sound. Now, in terms of how to form these, obviously the only difference is the position of that little dot above the character. But the way to form these is to write something like this, and then give 1 line in the middle, and then position the dot on either side. So that would be our shin. Alternatively, that would be our shin if we were to place the dot on this side. Now, regardless of where we place that, obviously that changes the character, but for how the character is formed, remember that's one kind of an open arc like this, and then one like that, something like a pitchfork almost of how that character looks. That's our shin and our sin characters that we're going to want to have. Those again, they are kind of grouped together, but they're also different. So if that takes us almost to the end of the alphabet, we've got one more character to learn, and this is our tav, the very end of the alphabet. And as we said, this could look something similar to our hey and our het, but our tav, we're going to do something that gives us no way of confusing these. If we get this right from the beginning, then we'll be smooth sailing from here on out. We're going to make an arc like this, something like a dalet or something like the top of a hey. But then we're going to join the character, and then at the foot, we're going to make sure we give it that angular foot so we really can't confuse it with a hey. This part here is really important for us because that's going to signal for us that we're not dealing with a het like this, but it's this foot here, or in our character, this foot here, that give us that telltale sign that this is a tav and it can be nothing else. So that is our Hebrew alphabet in terms of how to write these characters. Now just one word on these guttural characters, which is something that we read about in our textbook but haven't quite flagged yet. We've looked at how to form all the letters, we've looked at how to form the final characters. We're not going to talk about all the difference between what is a labial and a dental sound. We'll leave that to the textbook. But the most important thing for us for now is to at least start to group certain characters in our minds together for the, I guess down the line we'll see the types of things that can happen to these characters. A guttural, the gutturals and resh we'll see goes along with these are characters that have a weak pronunciation value. Unlike a beit, a gimel, a dalet, for example, those all have a hard pronunciation value. But the gutturals don't quite have that, and they'll often adopt the sound of a character or a vowel around them, or as we'll see later on when we look at some words and forms, they might even lose their value to hold the sound and be represented on the page but not pronounced at all. So which characters are we talking about? Gutturals are aleph, so that's in some ways has an A sound, but in some ways has no sound at all. Aleph. Hey, you can hear that's weak already. Our het will behave this way as well. Our ayin, which we flagged earlier on, those are technically our group of characters that we're going to call gutturals, but as we'll see throughout the term, at times or most often, our resh, even though that has a pronunciation value of an R, that sound, it will behave like a guttural. It wants to be a guttural at the best of times. So quite often we'll use the terminology of the gutturals and resh, and those are the characters that we're having in mind here. So that's the formation, that's the more or less the pronunciation value of our Hebrew alphabet. So why don't we go through it just one more time before we turn into consider one last topic. So we have Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Samek, Ayin, Pei, Tsare, Kof, Resh, Shin, Sin, Tav. And those are going to be all of the consonants that we're going to be seeing throughout the semester. So we know how to write them. If we can get that order in our mind, then we'll be in good shape. Now, the last topic that we want to spend at least a moment on before we kind of conclude this lesson on the Hebrew alphabet has to do with these 6 characters. Quite often we'll refer to these as begad kefat characters. Begad kefat. Now that's just a mnemonic device for what we see here. The Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pei, and Tav. Begad kefat. Those 6 characters. Now why are we signaling these or bringing these out together? We talked about gutturals and bringing those together as a group of characters that might have some varied pronunciation, as we'll see throughout the term. These will have varied pronunciation depending on if we have this little dot appear within them. We're going to get to what this is called. It's called a dagesh, and what it does in a few lessons. But for now, we'll just pay attention. That's the only dot we've seen so far within a character, and it's the only time we'll see one within a character. And when it's placed within one of these Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pei, and Tav. The effect is it changes the pronunciation value. Now, technically, it changes the pronunciation value on all of these, all 6 of these characters. But for our purposes in learning Biblical Hebrew, we're only going to differentiate between 3 of these characters: the Beit, the Kaf, and the Pei. If we were to learn modern Hebrew, we would find that modern Hebrew does the same thing. So we're kind of taking our cue from modern Hebrew and only differentiating between these 2, or these 3 rather. And the differences that we see are more evident here, and that's probably why. So if we have a character, let's start on the right with the Beit that has no dagesh, no dot, then it's a V sound, as in V, victory. But if we have a dot, dagesh, in it, it changes to a B sound, battle. Victory or battle. If we move down the line, again, we could do a slight pronunciation difference for us here, but for our purposes, we're going to pronounce both of these as a G sound. Same thing with the Dalet. These will both be a D sound. Where we'll see some differences in, again, at least the way that we're going to work with the language in this course for our purposes. If we have a Kaf without the dot, without the dagesh, then what we're going to pronounce that is almost like a CH sound in the word lach, or the composer Bach. We're going to have that kind of back of throat sound that almost is a CH, an airy kind of CH sound. And where that will look different for us, or sound different rather, is if we have that dot. If we have that dagesh, it's going to be a hard, almost K sound, king. Lach, king. Bach, king. So we're hearing those 2 things, those 2 sounds differently based on that tiny little dot that's achieving that difference for us. Next up, we have our set of Peis. Now, I should mention that these dageshes, these dots, can also show up in our final characters, as we learned from our last slide. So keep that in mind. That will affect both of these, but the pronunciation will be the same. If we have a character like the Pei without the dot, then that will be this sound here, our alpha, ph, f, alpha. However, if we have the dot, that dagesh, in the character, then we get that hard sound again, similar to what we had in the previous character. This will be that sound here, p, pipe. Now, in the same way as we said for the Gimel and the Dalet, for the Tav, we're not really going to differentiate between these, although some grammarians might make this a t sound versus a th, like a th sound. For us, at least in the course, we are going to pronounce this most always with a hard T sound rather than differentiate between the 2. So that's the first kind of dive into Biblical Hebrew. That's the alphabet. That's a few things about the alphabet, a few things that we might want to just kind of remind ourselves of. At least at this point, we haven't technically learned any vowels because Hebrew does not have vowels built into the language. It's a consonantal language. We're going to learn vowels, but the vowels that we learn in our next session will be thanks to those Masoretes that copied those manuscripts that we know later on, like the Aleppo Codex or the Leningrad Codex. Again, things that were different perhaps for us from English were some characters that have medial and final positions that are written differently. So we want to make sure we kind of include those in our understanding of the Hebrew language, the Hebrew alphabet. Those gutturals, those 5 characters, the gutturals and resh, just flag those for now in our minds because we're going to come back to those time and time again and see that they behave a little bit differently. So if we expect that, then it won't surprise us later on. And then lastly, these begad kefat letters, these 6 characters that we've just dealt with here, where we have a varied pronunciation value. But again, we can kind of carve that in half because we're only going to be differentiating between the bet, the kaf, and the pei. In terms of the alphabet, that is about everything we need to know for getting up and running with some of the sights and sounds. Now, the next big thing we're going to be dealing with is vowels. So before we dive into that, make sure you've had a chance to dig into this chapter in Ross on the alphabet. And next up, we'll be learning Hebrew vowels.